on December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks boarded bus 2857 in Montgomery, Alabama. Had she been paying attention, Parks later stated that she would not have boarded that particular bus since driver James F. Blake was known for using derogatory language towards blacks. In compliance with Alabama segregation laws, he would make black passengers pay their fare at the front of the bus, get off, and re-enter the bus at the rear entrance, but Blake was notorious for pulling away before black passengers could reboard. For 12 years, Parks had avoided riding any bus Blake drove, but on this day, Rosa Parks sat down in the front of the section of seats that were first come first served for blacks and whites. When the driver noticed one white man standing, Blake ordered Parks and 3 other black passengers to vacate their row. Everyone left but Parks, who shifted over closer to the window but refused to give up her seat. When Blake threatened to have her arrested, Parks consented with a quiet, "You may do that." Despite contradictory city laws, Parks was found guilty and fined. Today, Rosa Parks is widely credited as being the first to approach the frontier of bus desegregation. In a recent survey, when asked who was the first black woman to refuse to give up her bus seat for a white passenger during the civil rights movement, 74.5% answered Rosa Parks.
But that is not correct. While Parks' protest was significant, the crossing of the frontier of bus desegregation actually began many years earlier. One cannot appreciate the impact of Parks' protest and the events that followed it without first understanding the contributions of those who fought desegregation before Rosa. Segregation was born as slavery died. When slavery was eliminated, some white communities sought new means of differentiation and oppression. After the end of the Civil War and in response to the ratification of the 13th Amendment, state and local laws were passed that legalized racial segregation in the southern states. Called Jim Crow laws, this legislation legitimized anti-black racism and used segregation to subjugate blacks as second-class citizens. Despite great risk, blacks protested these laws. In 1892, Homer Plessy and some young black men from New Orleans decided to test the interstate constitutionality of the separate car law. On June 7th, Plessy refused to sit in the train car designated for blacks. His lawyer argued that sitting in a separate train car was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. But in the 1896 court case, Plessy v. Ferguson, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of equal but separate accommodations for the white and colored races. The court denied that segregated railcars were necessarily inferior, stating that if they were viewed that way, it was solely because the colored race chooses to put that construction upon it. The Supreme Court's decision upheld the continued segregation of blacks in the U.S. for another 60 years.
But blacks continued to fight segregation with both individual protest and legal action. Unfortunately, there is little information about many who protested bus segregation in the decades leading up to Rosa Parks, but there are a few notable examples. In Alabama, 11 years before Rosa Parks' protest, Viola White was beaten and arrested for refusing to give up her seat. The police retaliated and an officer attacked and raped her 16-year-old daughter. Although White attempted to bring her case to court, the city of Montgomery knew they couldn't win and suspended it indefinitely.
That same year, on July 16th, Irene Morgan Kirkcaldy boarded a Greyhound interstate bus from Virginia to Maryland. 30 minutes into the drive, when Kirkcaldy refused to give up her seat for a white couple, the bus driver headed straight to a nearby town's jailhouse and handed a resistant Kirkcaldy over to the authorities. Kirkcaldy's later court case, Morgan v. Virginia, was actually the first to successfully cross the frontier of interstate bus desegregation when, in 1946, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on Virginia's interstate buses was unconstitutional. Even though Virginia and other southern states continued to enforce racial segregation on interstate transport, the ruling nonetheless signified important legal progress.
In 1949, Joanne Robinson moved to Montgomery to work as a professor at Alabama State College. When boarding the bus to Cleveland for Christmas, she sat down in the whites-only section of the bus. The driver screamed at her to move. Robinson got off crying, feeling like she'd been treated like an animal. While Robinson was too shocked to protest in that moment, she more than made up for it later. The next year, when Robinson became president of the Women's Political Council, she made desegregating Montgomery's buses one of her top priorities, and she later designed and implemented the plan for the catalytic Montgomery bus boycott.
On August 1, 1952, Sarah Keyes, an Army private on her way home from Fort Dix, New Jersey, was arrested for refusing to give up her seat for a white Marine during a stop in North Carolina. Keyes sought justice through her court case, Sarah Keyes v. Carolina Coach Company. The Interstate Commerce Commission reviewed her case, and the ruling was announced just 6 days before Rosa Parks' protest. Keyes made history when the ICC outlawed segregated seating sections even on private buses traveling across state lines. Keyes' case was unique in the crossing of the legal frontier against segregation since it was the only explicit rejection of the Plessy v. Ferguson policy ever made by a court or federal organization in regards to interstate bus travel.
On June 15, 1953, Martha White boarded a bus in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and sat in the only seat left in the whites-only section. The Jim Crow laws were being more aggressively enforced, and Martha White was thrown off the bus. White's experience was the impetus for the first large-scale bus boycott. The Baton Rouge bus boycott lasted only a week and gained little, but it served as the template for the later Montgomery bus boycott.
As bus desegregation efforts intensified, they were bolstered by desegregation advances in other spheres. In 1954, in Brown v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court overturned the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson verdict and ended school segregation. The court unanimously ruled that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place, as segregated schools are inherently unequal.
In May 1955, the Supreme Court issued an additional opinion in the Brown v. Board of Education II case, which assigned future desegregation cases to lower federal courts and also directed district courts and school boards to proceed with desegregation with all deliberate speed. While well-intended, the unfortunate effect of this decision was that by allocating control to state and local authorities, it actually allowed resistant areas to avoid desegregating.
In 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, a series of refusals by black women to give up their seats on buses eventually led to all four being named as plaintiffs in the federal civil case, Browder v. Gale, which became the ideal case to challenge bus segregation laws. On March 2nd, 15-year-old Claudette Colvin refused to give up her seat to a white woman.
History had me glued to the seat. Felt as though Harriet Tubman hands were pushing me down on one shoulder, and Sojourner Truth hand was pushing me down on the other shoulder.
Colvin was forcibly removed from the bus while she continued to scream that her constitutional rights were being violated.
1 month later, Aurelia Browder, a civil rights activist, was also jailed.
On October 21st, in separate incidents, 18-year-old Mary Louise Smith and Susie McDonald, a widow in her 70s, were similarly arrested. None of these women's protests elicited a widespread response, but 41 days later, Rosa Parks made her stand against segregation, and the entire country heard about it. Joanne Robinson, who had been waiting to launch her bus boycott plan, used Parks' arrest to mobilize black citizens. Robinson had been frustrated when civil rights leaders didn't use Claudette Colvin's arrest 9 months earlier to initiate a larger protest. Robinson and the WPC copied and distributed 50,000 flyers calling for a one-day citywide bus boycott just 4 days later, the day of Parks' trial. The protest was a unified response by nearly all 40,000 black bus riders, 75% of the city's ridership. The December 5th boycott was so successful that black leaders met that afternoon and formed the Montgomery Improvement Association, electing Martin Luther King Jr., a 26-year-old pastor, as its chairman to manage the continuation of the protest, which became known as the Montgomery Bus Boycott.
While Montgomery's bus boycott gained international attention and created intense political pressure, it is often inaccurately credited with ending segregation. It was actually the court case Browder v. Gale that ended bus segregation. 2 months into the boycott and 2 days after Martin Luther King Jr.'s home was bombed by segregationists, Fred Gray, with support from the NAACP, filed a suit in district court using the cases of 4 of the Montgomery women who had been arrested in 1955 for bus segregation defiance. Since Gray had already filed an appeal for Parks' criminal charges that was tied up in the state court, she was not included in the new suit because Gray wanted the court to have only one issue to decide: the constitutionality of the laws requiring segregation on the buses. On June 5th, history was changed when a Montgomery federal court ruled in Browder v. Gale that segregation on buses was unconstitutional. The city appealed, but on December 20th, 1956, the Supreme Court upheld the decision, and blacks finally reached the other side of the frontier of bus desegregation. Montgomery ended its boycott the following day when the buses were legally integrated.
Some argue that Parks is the appropriate symbol of bus desegregation because her protest prompted Montgomery's successful bus boycott, elevated Martin Luther King Jr. to a position of leadership, and invigorated the civil rights movement, all of which supported the filing of Browder v. Gale. Parks became an icon as the face of the Montgomery bus boycott and is often referred to as the mother of the civil rights movement. Others maintain that the everyday citizens who bravely protested and filed court cases which achieved legal changes, like Browder v. Gale, were those who really abolished segregation. Regardless, few frontiers are crossed by one person alone, and in the case of bus desegregation, it is essential to remember and acknowledge the contributions of the countless, nameless, and often forgotten heroes who advanced that cause. Rosa Parks' stand set into motion the final crossing, but we must also honor those who came before Rosa.